I'm Meshal Malik and you're watching Indus Special. The European Commission has unveiled the European Climate Law, the EU's first legally binding law that tackles the issue of climate and sets the stage for a green transformation. The law aims to put into motion the goals set out in the European Green Deal for Europe's economy and society to become climate neutral by 2050. But what are the chances of this law driving the transformation it claims to achieve, and how will it impact the world? We'll discuss this further on our show today. Joining us for this discussion is Mr. Sven Hermling, who's an ex-Care International, which deals with global policy and climate change and resilience. He joins us from Bonn. Also joining us is Sandrine Dixson, who's an energy policy expert and formerly directed the EU office of the Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership. She joins us from Brussels. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Sandrine, I'd like to begin with you. Now, when we're talking about this deal, it seems to be very, very ambitious, but what exactly does it entail?
So the law itself is not yet the full deal. This is just the legal framework that enables us actually to translate the objective of being climate neutral by 2050. And that is, I think, very important because most people don't realize that this is just the first pillar in ensuring that we have the legal basis to move forward. Then there will be a series of directives or other regulations that will actually come out, which will put in stone some of the real shifts that we want to see around agriculture, the food to fork policy, around industrial and the new kind of industrial revolution, innovation, moving towards climate neutrality, as well as obviously energy and shifting our energy resources. So this is only the first step in having the legal framework that we need.
Right, and you're talking about this just being the initial step. How much more needs to be done to actually put this thing in motion?
Oh, it's going to be quite a challenge. I think the Green Deal itself, when you look at all the different policy proposals, is probably one of the greatest new Marshall plans for the European Union. And the beauty of it, and we often talk about the environmental aspects, but I think it's really important to say that the Green Deal and the way in which the President von der Leyen is trying to put forward her new thinking brings in social implications, the human dimension, the just transition elements of how we actually move towards a low carbon economy. So I would say that this is going to take probably her presidency the next 5 years to ensure that we put in place all of the right legislation. It builds on, of course, existing legislation. We already have a climate package. We already have objectives for 2030, but it goes further in order to instill those objectives, in order to ensure that sectors across all different parts of the European economy are moving towards 2050 in sync. But again, I just want to make my last point, which is many people don't realize that there are many underlying thoughts around how do we bring people on board? How do we ensure the human dimension? How do we ensure that we actually bring workers on this journey, ensure the upskilling, the new skills, and the new jobs?
Right. And Sandrine, we're going to talk more the human angle of this. If everyone can come on board potentially for something like this that is being seen as being so transformative. Sven, just jumping to you and talking to you a little more about Europe's and the European Union's track record so far when it comes to trying to reduce emissions. Now, we know that the European Union comes up in the top 3 alongside the United States and China when it comes to the overall contribution to emissions. But how has it been so far in trying to reduce its record there?
Yeah, I think overall we can say that of course the European Union still has a high responsibility in terms of bringing emissions down further, but I think we can also say that there has been quite some progress over the last years. I think currently we stand at something like below 24-25% of CO2 emissions below 1990, despite some significant economic growth. But we've also seen years where some of the instruments that the European Union installed were quite weak, like the emissions trading system, for example, which only has really managed to have an effect over the last couple of years when emissions prices rose. We also see that the progress across the European member states is quite uneven in terms of expanding renewable energies and bringing down emissions emissions. So it's overall, I think, going to the right direction. We're going to probably talk later about what we need for the future ambition. So track record is not that bad, but there's much more that needs to happen.
We're talking a lot about what needs to happen. Sandrine mentioned this. You also, Sven, mentioned this. When we talk about making the economy and society carbon neutral, isn't that the end goal, or what more needs to be done after that?
Well, I think in a way you can say it's the end goal, but it matters when we achieve that goal, and also the trajectory towards it matters. I mean, climate neutrality, net zero can be expressed in various terms, and you can get there quickly by reducing emissions quickly, or you can get there slowly with, for example, compensating a lot of the emissions. But what we actually need from a global scientific perspective is that the actual emissions have to get down much more quickly. And we believe that there's a lot of potential for European society, and as well as other countries, of course, to use this as an eco-societal transformation, which can reduce our global footprint in terms of resource consumption and CO2 emissions, etc. But that really needs, and that's one of the, let's say, vague or unsettled pieces of the European climate law. We need to step up the emission reductions by 2030, ideally to 65% emission reductions, and not only 50% or 55%, which the Commission is proposing.
Right. Sandrine, now, while we're hearing about this deal, you've reiterated the fact that this is just one piece of the larger problem. But we're getting a lot of criticism coming about this deal as well, one that came from climate activist Greta Thunberg. Let's listen to what she had to say about this deal.
When your house is on fire, you don't wait a few more years to start putting it out. And yet, this is what the Commission are proposing today. When the EU presents this climate law and net zero by 2050, you indirectly admit surrender, that you are giving up on the Paris Agreement, giving up on your promises, and giving up on doing everything you possibly can to ensure a safe future for your own children.
So indirectly giving up on the Paris Agreement, meaning that the set target of 2030 isn't going to be met. You're extending the deadline up to 2050. Sandrine, is this a smokescreen that is created of sorts to detract from the fact that you're not going to meet the Paris Agreement deadline of 2030?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I was with Greta in Paris actually on Friday, and I completely understand her concerns, and also what your previous speaker indicated. The European Parliament is pushing very much for 60 to 65% as a 2030 target. This target now in the climate law is not set in stone. The conversation needs to be around the impact assessment that they're going to deliver with the climate law, and the possibility in the next council agreement and before actually COP26 coming to an agreement for more than 50%. If we're just going to land on 50%, then yes, that might be too little. I do think it's really important, though, it's interesting. We always hone in on Europe. Europe is doing quite a lot in comparison to a lot of other regions and countries. And clearly, again, as the other speaker indicated, we do have an issue across Europe in terms of some countries that are moving faster. But what's interesting here is that all member states have indicated that this is the right way to move forward. And now what we need to do is up the game. The president, for the first time, has put forward this law and also a plan of action. That plan of action needs to be comparable to the emergency at hand. That is clear. But what I think is very important is that we ensure that we work with the European Commission to make this the most transformational that we've ever seen. And they are very open to that. So this is really the start of a process. It's not the end of a process. And I just want to add one thing in terms of how we've transformed our economy so far. I mean, the EU has already started to modernize and transform the economy with the aim of climate neutrality. And we can already see that between 1990 and 2018, we reduced greenhouse gas emissions by 23%. Now, that is clearly not enough. However, it's really important to start to show that we can decouple emissions from the economy. So the economy continued to grow by 61%, but we reduced our emissions by 23%. And now we need to up the game. And even the Commission is ready to say, we cannot reduce greenhouse gas emissions by the same amount of trend. We need to double, triple the impact. And that is where they're trying to go.
Right. Sandrine, now you mentioned that you were with Greta in Paris there. You understood her sentiments. She probably echoes the sentiments of many other young people. And the information you're putting here, you feel like this is the best that can be done in this situation. The trajectory is upwards. How do you translate this information and communicate it to young people? And how do you get them on board to move towards this goal with you?
So no, I'm not saying this is the best. I'm saying this is a start. I'm saying that we definitely need to continue to push the European Commission and member states to go further. But I also think that we need to speak to all parts of the community. We need to, and our role at the Club of Rome is to ensure that we actually work with those that are going to be part of the just transition, those that are going to shift out of coal. We need to work with the unions. And part of the conversation with the youth is, first of all, to give them hope that we can create a vision of emerging from emergency, to ensure that we do hold all leaders accountable, but also that we work together to focus on core actions first. So one of the discussions that I'm having with the youth continuously is, let's make sure that we pull out of fossil energy first. That already will have a huge impact on our emissions. Let's then look at our materials use. Let's make sure we put in place the right measures to stop consumption, which is skyrocketing, which we obviously need. So we need to look at a variety of different actions as well in order to really start to hold governments accountable and call for those actions.
Right. So now, as Sandrine mentioned, that this process needs to be just. It needs to bring out different segments of community together. They all need to be a part of the process. No one gets left behind. Do you see a potential pushback from community members here? There are fears surrounding this. The Yellow Vest protests, for instance, serve as an example of when measures are taken to move towards more sustainable policies. There can be a pushback from a majority of the people. Do you foresee that happening here?
Well, I think generally there's still a lot of support in Europe for ambitious climate policies. If you look into different polls of the population, I think an example like the Yellow Vest is probably a bit simplified if it's reduced to its climate policy component, because there's a lot of underlying injustices related to that situation. I think that's a key challenge and a key opportunity as well for this European Green Deal, if it's implemented in a way that it really shows we can also address social injustices while we are also addressing the climate injustice. Then we can get many people on board, and there are many opportunities. I also would like to flag that one of the elements where the law is still quite weak, and this needs to improve either in the law itself or the implementation, is the external dimensions of the European Green Deal in terms of cooperating with other countries, supporting developing countries in their efforts to go to similar and
where do you think it's weak in that terms? Where do you think a weak spot is when you're saying that it needs to improve and strengthen that aspect?
Yeah, I mean, the law itself, for example, doesn't make any mention of global equity, and that the European Union also needs to position itself in terms of climate neutrality, for example, from an equity perspective. That means generally that developed countries like the EU have to even be faster than 2050 from a global perspective to get to climate neutrality. And similarly, also, I think that the timeline about the 2030 target revision, and that's where the Commission hasn't really responded to the questions in terms of how this can trigger other large economies to also revise their 2030 targets this year, to basically do it in a way that it can be available well before the COP at the end of this year, the big climate conference. And the timeline currently creates the concerns that the EU will only be ready to adopt a new such target in next year, which would be too late. Finally, a point where we feel there's also much more that can be done in terms of bringing the population on board is that the law itself and the package so far is really gender blind. It doesn't take into account any of the aspects related to climate action and how you need to take into account the roles of different genders, how women empowerment would be quite important to move towards those targets. So these are some of the areas which need to be improved.
Right. Thank you so much, Mr. Sven, for joining us and shedding light on this. Sandrine, now he raised a number of issues. Sven Hermling raised a number of issues here. Do you feel like that will be worked out throughout, or do you feel like it needs to be done now?
So I completely agree with the last statement, first around the decade of action. You know, this really, we need to show that we can actually step up to the plate much faster than waiting till 2050. So that's definitely one of the first points. And yes, I do think that by working hard with the European Commission, different stakeholders, the last point I would make also in terms of the international dimension is I was lucky enough to actually speak in front of 150 delegates from the EU delegations who have champions now on the Green Deal across the globe. And their role is very much both to have an exchange of knowledge and also looking at new development opportunities and working together, not as aid, but in terms of concrete actions, both in terms of policy assistance in the development of policies within their countries, but also in terms of knowledge and technology exchange. Right. So I think this is going to be a huge learning period for all of us. The most important point is we cannot allow this to fail here at the European level. It's the first time that we have such a comprehensive program anywhere in the world. And this is a huge learning experience and an example of what can be done if we're ambitious.
Sandrine, sorry to interject here, but as you mentioned, it's very important for it to succeed. But we know that realpolitik often takes precedence over issues like this. Do you fear political backlash, especially when we see many right-wing governments being propped up all over Europe? Do you fear that as being a possible hindrance in this?
There's always a possibility. I fully agree with the past statement as well. Listen, the Gilets jaunes issue was not just an environmental issue. If we had delved down into the economic aspects of why the people went into the streets, we could have solved some of those issues. So the economics of this is key, and that's what we need to get right. The communication is key. We need to make people understand that actually the Green Deal is a perfect deal for people, planet, and prosperity. That's what we talk about. It brings more equity. It ensures that we make communities more resilient. If we work properly with rural communities as well as urban communities, we can bring them on board. Personally, I don't agree that the way people are living their lives today is a very positive way. And if you look at what coronavirus is doing, I actually think that people need some hope. We need to give them hope in terms of a new vision, again, around what prosperity will actually be brought through the Green Deal. And I think we can do that. So I don't see it as contrary. I do think we need to be strategic, though, and I do think that the other side, some climate denialers and also the populist movements, will try to hijack this in saying that it's not good for people.
Right. Of course, narrative building comes part and parcel of issues like these that call for a transformative change. But stay with me, Sandrine, on that point. I also want to introduce Mr. Gilbert Vankerckhove, who's an author and an economist. He wrote the book, Toxic Capitalism. He joins us from Beijing. Thank you so much for joining us, Gilbert. We're talking about this Green New Deal that Europe has put forth. It wants to turn this into a law. It wants transformative change to be brought. But the conversation we've been having is that Europe is seeming to do better than many other parts in the world. China, the United States, that contribute as the top emitters of carbon, they don't seem to be on the right track. Do you feel like this will create inspiration? Do you think that this deal might create ripples all across the world?
Well, I think also in Europe, we are not really doing the best that we can. As we mentioned already, as you mentioned, we have the COVID virus also on us now, and this might also delay a lot of decision making within Europe. We are now a little bit short of time, because in Europe we have been trying to set new goals for the reduction of greenhouse gases. However, people do not agree on the levels. We need already to increase from the 40% reduction planned for 2030, we should go up, according to the Commission, at least to 50% or 55%. Some say this is still not enough. We should go to 65 or 70%.
Gilbert, that is something that most of the panel on our show today agreed upon, that we still need to do much better. But the conversation goes that if Europe is doing this, will this cause a ripple across the world? What does this mean for the world? Will other countries that are contributing to such high number of emissions, will they follow suit?
Yes, correctly. The whole problem is, will Europe succeed to fasten its seatbelt and go ahead with the plans? Because if we want to influence the other countries in the world, in Europe, the target is actually to set new goals by June of this year, so that when the meetings come up between Europe and China in September, and then later on the UN climate change meetings come up in November, that Europe is ready and can put something on the table that is much better than we have been seeing today. Now, Europe is extremely divided. I saw a breakdown of all the different countries and their different attitudes, and it's not a very nice picture, if I may say so. You're right. Europe could give an example to the rest of the world. We are talking about the United States, but we also talk about China here, to say, guys, you have to do at least as well as we do. The whole problem is we are not there yet. We just hope. Yes, Europe can give the example. Yes, Europe can lead the way, but we are not there yet.
Right. Sandrine, do you agree on that point that Europe doesn't have the leverage at this point in time to push other countries, push other developed nations that are contributing largely to this problem to the right path?
So it's an interesting discussion. I mean, I personally think that Europe from the beginning has been trying to work on ambition within the UN, in the discussions and the negotiations. They're the ones that actually worked with the coalition of ambitious groups. They're the ones that actually worked with most of the developing member states to try to come up with more ambitious targets. So will Europe actually be able to continue to demonstrate a leadership position? On climate, it is anyway, because the United States definitely isn't. It's working with China through its summit. We'll definitely have discussions on this. The question is, can it get its act together in terms of its member states? And I do agree that there are member states that are more takers of the technology, takers of the decarbonization economy rather than makers. They're the ones that actually are going to suffer, in particular in Central and Eastern European countries. But then the question there is, how do we work with those countries in order to transform their economies in a different way? And also, what are the financial capabilities? What are the just transition funds that we're going to
Sandrine,
give?
and on that specific point, how to deal with other countries, especially in the European Union. Well, UK not being a part of it anymore, but in 2016, and these are some of the latest figures that were available, the UK led in giving subsidies to fossil fuels, and it seems to be on that same trajectory. Does that worry you, that this will become a problem for the rest of the continent?
So the fossil fuel subsidy is one of the greatest calls that we've been making forever. I mean, for the last 10 years, and even on the G8 and the G20 negotiations, we've had the discussion around phasing out of fossil fuels. It's fossil fuels and fossil fuel subsidies. If you just translated the billions that were going into fossil fuel subsidies, it would actually give you the amount of money that you needed and more. So 17% of those funds could be targeted to specific solutions in terms of shifting to a low carbon economy. That's why it's so important that globally, also in Europe, we eliminate fossil energy and also fossil fuels. And I would say very clearly that we often talk about new money. A lot of this is about perversities in the market. We need to shift taxation from people to products. We need to start thinking about embedded carbon. I mean, we see right now the disruption we're getting from coronavirus in terms of the lack of products that are coming from China, but the emissions have decreased from China, as have the overall emissions in Europe, because actually we've been importing less carbon products or products that are embedded with carbon emissions. Right. So we really need to think about how we put in place the right economic and financial tools as we start to shift. The last point I just want to make, we cannot stand complacent. We have no choice. We are not going to be able to rebuild glaciers or to have immediately the regrowth of forests that have been burned down. So pretty much we are faced with an emergency situation, and the European Union is the first region that is taking this head on.
Right. Gilbert, that is an important, that we are in an emergency situation. The European Union is the first one to take this step, the first region to take this step. When we're talking about meetings between China and the European Union later on, what is there to expect?
I fully agree with what the lady was just saying now. And one of the issues is, of course, the issues of subsidies for fossil fuels, but also for other climate damaging sectors that has been tackled. And those funds could be used very well. Now, if we look at this law that is coming up, for some people, it means giving up. Like the famous Swedish girl, Greta Thunberg, she actually said this project draft law means...
Gilbert, sorry, since we're running short on time, I'd just like to get to the part about what to expect in the future, especially when it comes to cooperation between China with the European Union.
Yes, I think, first of all, we have to see that this law, if it comes into force in Europe, is a solid law, not a hollow law. Otherwise, how can we discuss with China? I mean, China is willing to do something about climate change. They are doing their best. And of course, today we live in a very unreal situation where actually we have never had so little pollution in China, but this is only a break within the normal industrial period. I think that only if Europe can come up as a strong ally and say, well, this is what we have done in Europe as a law. These are the targets we are doing, not just for 2030, but from today on 2020, as Greta Thunberg is actually asking for, then we can argue with China.
On that point, Gilbert, for cutting you off there, but that is the point I'm going to have to end this segment on, that Europe needs to be in the superior position to gain some leverage, also to convince other regions in the world. That's the essential point that Gilbert was making here. And on that, we're going to end the segment. Thank you so much, Mr. Gilbert Vankerckhove, for joining us, and Sandrine Dixson for joining us. We're going to go for a short break, but when we come back, we take a look at the state of affordable housing around the world. Stay tuned. Welcome back to the show. The housing crisis is leaving millions around the world unable to afford having a home. But what really drives this crisis, and can we find solutions in the way we design our cities? Let's take a look at the story in greater depth. Joining us for this discussion is Mr. David Rudlin, who is the principal and director of Urbanism, Environment and Design, which is a research consultancy. He's also author of Climate City. He joins us from Manchester. Also joining us today is Professor Lyal Sunga, who is a human rights expert. He joins us from Rome. Thank you both for joining us, and welcome to the show. Mr. Rudlin, I'd like to begin with you. Now, when we talk about the fact that many are being left behind in the world when it comes to having shelter or a home, how widespread of a problem do you feel like this is, especially when we're talking about nations which have been doing fairly well, developed nations?
I think the global figures are something like 1 in 8 people are living in informal settlements or without housing. But actually about a third of new housing production in the world is informal as well. So the problem is huge. The problem is huge. And actually, I'm speaking here from Manchester in the UK, and we have the problem here as much, well, maybe not as much as some places, but certainly we have a problem here. It is a global problem in terms of the amount of housing we have and the equity with which it's distributed.
Right. We're talking about the which this is distributed, the basic right to having shelter and to being warm in your own home. But Professor Sunga, when we try to understand this problem, is there a global framework in which we can understand the issue of homelessness? And is it different from the case of displacement?
Well, it's related to displacement simply because the right to adequate housing, is the way it's framed in international human rights law, is related to, for example, climate change, natural disasters, and refugee movements, and as was mentioned by the previous, my colleague, lack of equity in distribution in terms of making the right to adequate housing a state priority. I mean, if you think that today there's, UN Habitat estimates around 150 million people worldwide are homeless, and something like 1.5 billion, it's a good proportion of the world's population, is inadequately housed. So that's a lot of a huge proportion of the world's population that is affected. Just if I can just add something quickly, it doesn't only affect the right to adequate housing per se. It's integrally linked, obviously, to the right to health, right to education, especially for children who are implicated. And it means that a lot of the other rights, economic, social, cultural rights, and also civil and political rights, very hard to enjoy or to exercise when the right to adequate housing is not properly provided and guaranteed and implemented at national level.
You're talking about the various other rights that are hindered or undermined, or the access of them is denied when you don't have access to proper housing. Can we also expand on the dangers and the human rights violations that become more possible when people are not given proper security or proper shelter?
Sure. If you look a little bit more closely at what does the right to adequate housing mean, you have to look at public spaces, access to public services, electricity, sewage, garbage disposal, and nobody's saying that the state has to provide luxury housing for everybody. Or even free of charge. That's not the issue. The issue is that you have to be able to make sure that every individual and families are living in peace and security and dignity. And sometimes people say, well, why should the state do this? And I just want to mention that the executive director of UN Habitat mentioned, it was Dr. Juan Close. He said a couple of years ago something I think that was very important. And he said that leaving the housing market entirely to the private sector has proven to be a big failure. So the state has to take a lead. And if we just remember back in 2008 what happened, you had massive disruption in the economy, which started with the housing crisis. And that was turned out to be a global phenomenon. And now with other challenges that we're facing, it's for me a time bomb that we're sitting on unless we put proper resources. Just one last thing I want to say is that $4.7 billion is spent per day on arms.
Right.
So some of this can be spent on housing as well as education, schools,
right.
and hospitals. And
right. Professor Sunga, stay with me on that important point. You mentioned a quote there, and it alludes towards a policy failure. Mr. David Rudlin, do you see this crisis as a part of a policy failure?
It is a policy failure. I think the issue is largely to do with urbanisation. So what is happening across the world is people are moving from rural areas to urban areas, and that's happening at differential rates. So in Europe, we're 80% urbanised, and so that movement is relatively small. In China, it's about 55-60%. In Pakistan, I think it's about a third urbanised at the moment, and the projections are that will become 2/3 urbanised within the next 30-40 years. Now, that's a huge rate of people moving to cities and requiring housing, and very few societies are able to match that rate of building. The only one that actually is able to do it is China. So in China, they're building housing for 10 million people a year moving to cities, and they're doing so, but they're doing so by building huge towers, forests of towers, very badly connected quite often to the cities, and 1,000 new towns. Now, whether states have the capacity to do that, and states which are facing huge levels of urbanisation are able to do that is another matter. There is another way of doing this, which is to facilitate people to solve their own problems. A lot of people turn up in cities that, of course, end up in slums, and slums are dreadful for all sorts of reasons. But the work that's going on elsewhere shows that by giving people tenure, by giving them low-cost loans, by giving them access to advice, then they can actually create good quality habitation themselves rather than relying on the state to do it. And my personal view is that actually that latter solution of self-help is probably a better solution than, say, building millions of homes.
Right. Mr. Rudlin, with me on that point, I just want to put a last question to Professor Lyal Sunga. Professor Sunga, when we talked earlier about the fact that displacement is going to increase all around the world, especially due to conflict and climate, what do you foresee happening in the next couple of years, given the conditions that already exist when it comes to housing?
Well, it just means that greater numbers of people are left in very vulnerable conditions. That is a recipe for social instability, spread of disease and epidemics and discontent, and in some cases violence, depending on the situation. So it's a very serious issue. I'm glad that Mr. Rudlin was mentioning that, his whole approach is on the cities and urbanization, because it's very much linked towards proper having a national housing policy as part of the urban policy framework in all countries. So that is key. And I just want to mention that the UN in 2016 in Quito, in Ecuador, had developed, I think, a very important policy framework where member states of the UN should share best practices in terms of concrete measures to ensure that states take the lead, but that they also, and this is another point that Mr. Rudlin mentioned, was that they consult, at least they consult and they involve people in those decisions. I'm not sure that the bottom-up approach, purely that will approach, but it has to be top-down and bottom-up towards coherent development policy and
Professor Sunga, that's a very interesting to put forth there, trying to bring more people onto the table in order to find the best solutions. Thank you so much for joining us from Rome. Mr. David Rudlin, what are your thoughts on what Professor Sunga just said there?
Well, I'm sitting here in the UK, and we had an experience through the 1950s and 60s where we demolished a huge amount of slum housing and we built municipal housing. And to be honest, it was an experiment which didn't work. We did it on too big a scale. We did too many impersonal modernist designs, which people didn't adapt to in terms of communities. And so, while I think the state has a huge role to play in terms of regulation and funding, I think that real power of this situation is to allow self-help and to allow people to create informal settlements which are high quality and have all the sanitation and so on within them. The state has that role. The state is crucial in that process. But I think a state-led process of modernist housing sometimes is counterproductive. That's certainly been our experience in the UK.
Right. Mr. Rudlin, I understand that you have done extensive research on the case of India. What do you feel like is different when we talk about the housing crisis all across the world, especially unique to this part of the world?
India has a very similar level of urbanization to Pakistan. It is looking at huge amounts of urban growth over the coming decades, and it is struggling with that. To be honest, India is not coping with that process as we talk at the moment. It also has a huge slum remediation program, which is just starting to gain momentum and is looking to regularize existing slums and to allow slum dwellers to upgrade their property. So I think that there is a lot of interesting work just starting in India, and it's really too early to say whether it's going to bear fruit. But certainly the problem of housing in India is immense.
Right. We're also joined by Mr. Mustafa Naeem, who's the CEO and principal architect of Mustafa Naeem Architects. He joins us from Lahore. Thank you so much, Mr. Naeem, for joining us, and welcome to our discussion here. Now, we're talking about the housing crisis, and especially talking about how urbanization is increasing. By every single year, we're seeing more and more people coming to these areas. It's becoming overcrowded. They're not able to afford basic housing or basic living standards. Do you feel like architecture or the way cities are planned can change, especially for old cities? We're sitting here in Pakistan. Do you feel like that's a possibility for old cities?
Well, the first and foremost thing that we have to look into is the socio-economic conditions of a specific country. Like every country is not homogeneous. So we have to see the issues at hand. And generally, like if you talk about Pakistan, the population growth is approximately at 3%. And every year, like in 2030, half of projected figures of 250 million will be living in cities. So the main issues at hand are, high birth rates, lesser basic facilities in rural areas, and that causes a push factor of people from rural areas to the urban areas. Now the urban fabric totally changes because this migration that happens due to these conditions. Now, it also has to be considered that migration it should not be considered as a part of the process of become homeless or being overcrowded. It's, I think, anything but natural. But first, we have to look at the drivers of these homelessness or probably the issues at hand.
Right. One more about these drivers, this issue, socioeconomic issues that you've mentioned, of course, there are underlying issues that need to be addressed. But when we do have this crisis, we do feel like it is inevitable in many ways for people to migrate to these cities for better opportunities, for a better chance at life. Can we talk about there being a better way to plan ahead?
Of course. I mean, if like options in Pakistan and the evidence is there that the previous governments have invested a lot of, infrastructure development in the major cities only. And the smaller cities, they've been, I won't say radicalized, but, they haven't been given the proper opportunities to actually flourish. Now, this causes eviction of the people from these cities. And when they eventually move, the problem starts coming up. Now, if I just, give you some figures that, State Bank has done a lot of research on this, and we have found that 4.4 million people in 2050 were, left short of houses. Now, when these people come to the urban cities, they obviously are looking for jobs, the economic welfare of their beings. But at the same time, when the city is not planned accordingly, because everything is being spent on that specific city, now this over-density causes a lot of problem because they have left those rural areas for a better life. Now, when they come into the city, the density is already there. And, right. In Lahore, water is provided like 4 to 16 hours per day. Now, this 4 hours per day is probably at places where these slums have been developing. And Karachi, is one of the biggest examples where these slum settlements have been regularized into the city. Now, 70% of the people are living in slums, while the rest are living in the urban cities. So the problem is basically first is to identify the problem and then see how these urban planners can give a better solution.
Right. I just want to put one last to Mr. David Rudlin. Mr. Rudlin, you of course work with a consultancy here, and we have been talking about not being able to put an exact figure to the number of people all around the world who are homeless or who have access to adequate housing. How important is data collection in this entire scenario?
I mean, I think cities need to, I think the migration of people to cities is inevitable. I think that's something we need to deal with. I think cities can accommodate large numbers of people. I think they have to plan properly for it. We've talked about housing, but things like transport become incredibly important in this respect. And also conditions, because what happens, and again, in Europe, the experience is that when cities become overcrowded, people start leaving cities, the middle class has started leaving cities, spending power starts to move outwards, and you get urban sprawl. This is the condition of men, particularly in the UK. And that's, again, puts huge strain on transport and facilities. And so I think you have to accept urban growth as a fact of life and plan properly for it in all spheres, not just housing.
Right. That is an important point, and we're going to end the segment on that. Thank you so much, Mr. David Rudlin, for joining us, Mustafa and Naeem for joining us. It was a pleasure talking to you both. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We will see you again tomorrow with more stories. Till then, goodbye and take care.